These were not the treatments of ignorant people. They were the best psychiatry money could buy. A tub sealed a patient's whole body in water for hours. One of these treatments actually worked and was shut down anyway. Further in, a pencil-thin instrument went in above a child's eyelid, and one case is still unwinding in court decades later. The Stage of Hysteria. Blanche Whitman walked onto Jean-Martin Charcot's stage at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris on a Tuesday in the late 1870s, and a packed lecture hall leaned forward to watch her collapse. Charcot was the most respected neurologist in France, and he believed hysteria was a real disorder of the nervous system, passed down through families and triggered by shock, showing itself in dramatic seizures and frozen, arched postures he photographed and cataloged like specimens. To the doctors in that hall, a woman's collapse on command read as proof, the visible signature of damage no scalpel could show. A diagnosis worked the way a label on a jar does. Once it was glued on, everyone treated whatever sat inside according to the label, never the contents. And Whitman's contents were rewritten for her, session after session, in front of an audience that paid to watch. She earned the nickname the Queen of the Hysterics, posed for photographs sold across Europe, and performed her symptoms for over a decade before Charcot's death ended the show. She did not disappear afterward. Whitman took work in a laboratory using radium and lost an arm and both legs before she died, to a disease that had no name yet either. The woman, once diagnosed on a stage for a sickness no one could prove, was later destroyed by one nobody suspected at all, Drapetomania. Doctors across the American South in 1851 had a new medical word for an old, human act: running from bondage. Samuel Cartwright, a physician in Louisiana, described enslaved people's desire to escape as a mental illness, Drapetomania, built from Greek words for runaway and madness. Plantation medicine of the period treated any resistance to slavery as a malfunction to be corrected, not a rational response to captivity. And Cartwright's paper was taken seriously enough to be reprinted and cited across the South in the years that followed. The reasoning ran backward, much like an alibi written after a crime instead of before it. The escape came first. The diagnosis was built afterward, to explain away what freedom obviously was. Cartwright's prescribed treatment for the condition included whipping, framed in his writing as prevention rather than punishment, applied to men and women whose only symptom was wanting to leave. An enslaved man on a Mississippi plantation, whose escape attempt was recorded in an overseer's ledger using Cartwright's new medical term instead of the word freedom, became one small entry in a system that had learned to write cruelty in the language of medicine. The word meant to prove that escape was madness is remembered today only as a case study in how science can be built to serve whoever already holds the power. The Rest Cure. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was 27, already publishing her writing, when she arrived at Silas Weir Mitchell's practice in Philadelphia in 1887, worn down by an exhaustion her regular doctors couldn't explain. Mitchell was the leading nerve specialist of his era, and like his colleagues, he believed the body held a fixed, limited store of nervous energy, one that reading, writing, or any mental exertion drained faster in women than in men, leaving them anxious and unable to function until that energy was allowed to refill completely. His prescription was total bed rest, isolation from her own family, a heavy fattening diet, and a firm ban on lifting a pen, holding a book, or doing much of anything at all. It treated the mind like a battery pulled entirely out of use, on the theory that the only way to recharge it was to disconnect it completely from every current running through it. Gilman left the treatment worse than she arrived, closer to the breakdown it was meant to prevent. Rather than staying quiet about it, she wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, a story built directly from her own months of enforced stillness, and mailed Mitchell a copy once it was published. The treatment ordered to cure her turned her into the writer whose account of it helped end it. The Insulin Coma Cure. It was marketed as psychiatry's most modern treatment, and it was also its most dangerous. Introduced by Manfred Sackel in Vienna in 1927. Sackel gave patients large doses of insulin until their blood sugar crashed and they slipped into a coma, a state he and his colleagues believed could reset a mind broken by schizophrenia. The theory held that a strong enough biological shock could jolt faulty neural pathways back into a healthier pattern, similar to how a hard restart clears a machine that is frozen completely. Think of it as unplugging an entire machine to fix one stuck program. Everything goes dark at once, including every part that was never broken in the first place. Patients at asylums like Vienna's Steinhof often went through dozens of induced comas within a single year. Hospital notes commonly describing weight gained from the forced feeding used to keep them alive between treatments, and moods flattened in ways families struggled to recognize. The procedure spread through psychiatric hospitals across Europe and the United States for over 2 decades, treated as standard care rather than experimental risk.
Later controlled studies comparing treated and untreated patients found little real difference in long-term outcomes. And the treatment, praised as psychiatry's most modern breakthrough, left many of its patients simply heavier, slower, and no better measured against evidence that arrived only decades afterward. The ice pick cure. The instrument slid in above the eyelid, thin enough to pass for a household item, because at first, it was one. Walter Freeman began performing transorbital lobotomies with an actual ice pick in the 1940s, later switching to a purpose-built version of the same tool, and by 1960, he had performed thousands of them across the United States, often in his own office without a surgeon present.
Psychiatry at the time believed severe agitation, violence, and chronic psychosis came from overactive connections running through the brain's frontal lobe, and that severing enough of those connections could calm a patient enough to leave an institution for good. The procedure worked comparable to cutting a house's telephone wires to stop an unwanted call. It ended the noise, but it cut every other line running through the same wall, whatever else that line was carrying. Howard Dully was 12 years old when his stepmother arranged for Freeman to operate on him in California in 1960, describing him to Freeman as defiant and moody, rather than seriously ill. Dully grew up flattened, unable to explain what exactly had changed in him, working ordinary jobs for decades before he requested his own medical file as an adult.
What he found was a diagnosis built on almost nothing. A few lines about a difficult childhood filed neatly under a procedure that had rewritten the rest of his life. The continuous bath. American asylum wards built an entire treatment around water, and it began spreading through hospitals in the 1890s, lasting for decades afterward. Doctors of the period believed that warm, continuously circulating water calmed an overstimulated nervous system without restraints, chains, or sedating drugs, which were considered far more dangerous. Patients were placed in long tubs, sometimes with a canvas cover stretched over the top and only the face left uncovered, and kept there for hours at a time, occasionally for most of a day. A woman in a Massachusetts asylum spent up to 12 hours daily wrapped in one of these covered tubs, her face the only part of her visible above the waterline, for weeks at a stretch, hospital logs describing her as measurably calmer within days. It was, in effect, a warm bath calming a fussy child before sleep, just stretched from minutes into hours and repeated for as long as the ward judged necessary. Continuous bathing actually did calm patients about as well as anything psychiatry had available at the time. It disappeared anyway, not because it failed, but because it required constant staff, watching every tub around the clock, at a cost few hospitals could keep paying. The refrigerator mother. By the 1950s, a leading theory in child psychiatry held that a child's withdrawal into silence wasn't something he was born with, but something his mother had caused. Bruno Bettelheim, running a residential school in Chicago, argued that a cold, emotionally distant mother prevented the early bonding a child needed, and that the resulting withdrawal, now recognized as autism, was a defense the child had built against her. The theory searched for a cause in the same spirit as a mechanic checking the driver before ever opening the hood, blaming the person steering rather than the engine underneath, treating a mother's warmth or coldness as diagnosable evidence rather than an ordinary difference in temperament.
A mother in Chicago sent her young son to Bettelheim's school on his advice in the early 1960s, separated from him for years at the institution's insistence, and was told repeatedly that her own coldness had caused his condition, a judgment she carried without being able to prove otherwise. Genetic and neurological research that followed, decades later, traced autism to biology present before birth, not to any mother's warmth or its absence, a correction that arrived only after an entire generation of parents had carried blame that had never belonged to them. Evelyn Hooker's blind test. In 1957, a psychologist named Evelyn Hooker set out to test something the psychiatric field considered already settled:
The official manual of the era classified homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance, built on the assumption that healthy psychological development required exclusively heterosexual attraction, and that any deviation signaled arrested development or unresolved trauma serious enough to require treatment. Hooker gave standard psychological tests to 30 men, half gay and half straight, matched for age, education, and background, then handed the anonymous results to expert judges and asked them to sort which set belonged to which group. It was something like handing out sealed, identical envelopes and asking judges to guess which ones held good news and which held bad, when both sets inside were, by every measure that mattered, the same. The judges could not reliably tell the groups apart.
One of Hooker's gay test subjects, a man in his 30s with a stable job and a decade-long relationship, produced results the judges rated among the healthiest in the entire study, regardless of orientation. Her published findings became part of the evidence that led the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality from its diagnostic manual in 1973.
The men once tested to prove a sickness turned out, on paper, to be some of the healthiest people in the room, and the diagnosis was the only unhealthy thing left standing. The manufactured memory. A wave of abuse accusations moved through American preschools during the 1980s, and at the center of nearly every one sat a therapist convinced a child's silence was hiding something the child didn't yet know how to say. Clinicians of the period believed traumatic memories, especially of abuse, could be fully buried by the mind and later recovered through repeated questioning, anatomical dolls, and hypnosis-like techniques, treating this as sound clinical practice rather than a risk to accuracy. The method functioned like a leading question repeated until it becomes the only answer left standing. The way asking a child, "And then the man hurt you, didn't he?" enough times can plant a memory of a man who was never in the room at all. Raymond Buckey, a teacher at the McMartin Preschool in California, was charged in 1984 based largely on testimony gathered this way, and spent 5 years in jail awaiting trial before the case. Then the longest and most expensive criminal trial in American history ended in 1990 with no convictions at all. Courts across the country are still unwinding convictions built on memories drawn out through the same leading techniques, some overturned only within the last several years, decades after the original panic that made the method famous had already faded from the news. If any of these histories changed how you think about a diagnosis you grew up trusting, tell us which one in the comments and subscribe for the next one.